I'd like to talk about Z moves. That's something that we haven't seen too much of, like theory and opinion videos go. I mean, maybe we have and I'm just out of the loop, but it seems like everyone's been focusing on the new Pokemon, the new forms, all the other really cool stuff that's been going on. But I'm a little bit concerned about the Z moves and how they're going to affect the meta. So I'd like to talk about, well, what I would hope we would see and what I hope we won't see. What I hope we won't see is actually really simple and straightforward. I hope they're not going to be just really, really powerful attacks like base, like 200 or so damage, because that would just be like a really easy way to design them. And I mean, keep in mind, like, they take up the whole item slot to use, so they're sort of like proto-mega. So if it takes up your entire item slot to use a Z move, it's got to be pretty good. But I hope it's good in the right direction, which I think would be designing them in a compelling way that would be interesting and influential to the meta without just doing a whole bunch of damage. I'm afraid that if Z moves do a whole bunch of damage, it'll basically just make Pokemon battles a 5v5. You'll just save your Z move for something that's troublesome to you. Both players will do this. You'll just wipe out a Pokemon in one shot, and then you'll move on to the next one. And I think that would make the battles obviously a lot less compelling and a lot less interesting. And yeah, you could switch in and you could tank a hit pretty well, but I mean, I'm afraid since it takes up an item slot, it would be way too powerful. Even on a not very effective hit, even on a resistance, it might wind up just being way too strong if they just go with a straight, powerful damage hit. To have the same type of Pokemon using the Z move, it just has to have that typing's move. So, what would I like to see in a Z move? It looks like they're probably going to introduce some information about this pretty soon, so my hopes and dreams might be irrelevant. You could think of this as what I'm hoping for, or if this video comes out after they've already announced what the Z moves are going to do and look like, what could have been. So what I would like to see in Z moves is something that's influential in a way that's nuanced and generally more interesting. Something that provides a lasting effect more than simply taking out a Pokemon with a lot of damage. I've sort of gone in and designed mechanically some concepts. They might not be perfectly balanced, but it's sort of hard to quantify exactly what would be a good level of balance, a good level of effect, when keeping in mind this is supposed to sort of be like a new mega evolution. It's supposed to be very influential. It takes an entire item slot, and you kind of have to really decide ahead of time what your strategy is going to be when you're placing a Z move on a Pokemon. First, I think I'll try to design around the Z moves that we already know about, at least in name. A couple premises that I would like to work with on Z moves would be more influential in the long term, more interesting to the course of a battle, as they are apparently intended to sort of match up with mega evolutions, which of course are very influential over the course of a battle. I would like it if Z moves provided a long-term effect, like almost like a weather effect or an entry hazard, or entry boost. Sort of like a Tailwind or a Stealth Rock's sort of effect. I think it would also be interesting if Z moves countered the effects of other Z moves, or possibly of all entry hazards. I think this would be a good idea for a few reasons. Firstly, it would make Z moves more interesting than simply being a big damage thing. And also, it would sort of set up a weird cost-reward situation. To get the most effect from something like this, you would obviously want to use it early, but if you know that your opponent has a chance to simply negate all that, then you might want to save it until they've used theirs. It would sort of set a back-and-forth situation, so players would have a harder time deciding when it's appropriate to use this big and important move to get the most effect. It would require a bit more planning, a bit more strategizing, than simply having, something along the lines of a free Hyper Beam or Giga Impact. Along with having lasting effects, I think it would also be interesting if Z moves had a unique stab mechanic, where instead of simply increasing damage, it could increase the effect of the long-term effect portion of the ability. Simply increasing damage is good enough for most moves, but since Z moves are designed apparently to be pretty special and influential, I think it would just be more interesting if the stab effect could increase other things aside from just base damage. This would put a new twist on deciding who gets your Z move, beyond just what will be the most effective as far as damage goes, but also what would be most effective as far as your strategy. Would you like to surprise them with a Pokemon that doesn't get it as a stab move, or would you like to go the more traditional route but get a more long-term effect? So first up, I would like to go over the Z moves that we already know about, that have already been released, at least in name, if not mechanic. So let's start with Bloom Doom. Now, when I think of the grass type, I tend to think of sort of status-related effects. We have Spore, of course, we've got the Powder moves, we've got Leech Seed. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on setting up status effects and sort of stalling out a more defensive sort of playstyle, especially with Pokemon like Amoonguss, Venusaur, things along those lines. They tend to be pretty bulky and tend to be focused more on the long game. I designed Bloom Doom to sort of emphasize these approaches. I gave it 60 base power so that it'd be a respectable hit and possibly dangerous on a quad weakness or even just a regular weakness. Now, the long-term effect, a 10% chance for an opponent to become confused on switch-in, and an additional 10% for it to become paralyzed, poisoned, or put to sleep. This plays along with the sort of effect Spore sort of theme, but it's a free effect Spore on switch-in for your opponent. This would work well with the sort of long game stall sort of mentality, and punish your opponent for switching in, or at least give them a strong chance to be punished for switching in. When I think electric types, I usually think speed. Manipulating speed, manipulating mobility. Of course we have Electrode, which is one of the fastest Pokemon in the game. Paralysis, which is the main electric status effect, decreases speed by a significant amount. And we have other abilities such as Electric Terrain, which tend to fit with the keeping things zippy and keeping things moving sort of feel. Gigavolt Havoc, 100 base power, and that would have a 25% chance to boost speed by one stage or reduce speed by one stage for anything that switches in, allies and opponents. And for the stab, that would increase that to a 50% chance. The long-term effect of Gigavolt Havoc plays on the idea of Havoc. All switch-ins, yours and your opponents, have a 25% chance to have their speed increased or decreased by one stage. This would sort of play along with the chaotic concept of electricity in general, and also play with the speed concepts. The stab effect would increase this chance to 50%. It would make matches a bit more chaotic, so you could go from a speed advantage to a speed disadvantage. Just generally make things more interesting. Gigavolt Havoc, I put at a base power of 100, so that it would be a nice solid attack. Generally, when you think of fire types, you think of power and aggression. I mean, think of Fire Blast, the sort of the big damage move with the crazy kanji effect. Flare Blitz, a huge damaging attack that's going to damage you too, but you don't care because you just want to get them destroyed. I mean, fire is a very aggressive sort of type. It fits thematically. For Inferno Overdrive, I went with an 80 base power, the stab increased to 120, and fire types get a boosted attack or special attack when they switch in. The idea originally was to go with a Sunny Day effect attached to a high damaging move, so you get a Sunny Day for free, but I was afraid that would be countered simply by switching out a Politoed or using a Rain Dance, and I felt like it would be more influential to simply give fire types an attack bonus on switch-in than do something that would be pretty easily countered by a non-Z move. Hydro Vortex for the water types. Now, when you think water types, at least when I think water types, I tend to think of sort of being strong in their element when we have things like Rain Dance teams, where they're not very good when it's not raining, but when there is rain, they're incredible. Same thing along the lines of Swift Swim. I mean, they seem to be centered on sort of mobility in the water, but not so much anywhere else. Like, they're a strong, well-balanced type that just gets better when you have them in water. I mean, seems to make sense. For Hydro Vortex, I had the base power at 80. Again, this one's stab simply increases the damage to 120. The ongoing effect, however, is that only water types can switch. Now, I picture sort of a big whirlpool sort of effect, given the name Vortex. Now, in the games as it is, Whirlpool traps opponents. Now, I thought it would be interesting if a Z move did essentially the same thing, but on an entire battle scale. So once this move is used, you have to either use water types to evade it and swim out of it, or you would have to be very careful with your next switch-ins to make sure they'll be able to handle whatever your opponent has. Of course, this effect would work both ways, so it would make the match a lot more of a challenge strategically to determine whether or not you want to simply switch into your Z-move user and negate the effect, or try to tank it out with a Pokemon that you think will be able to handle the rest of their team. Either way, it would be a very influential effect and stay in line with the sort of mobility and being in the element sort of theme. So with Hydro Vortex, the ongoing effect is that only water types can switch. Those are the moves that we have heard about so far. I mean, we've seen images of a few others. We've seen the fighting and ghost type. We don't know the names yet, and we don't know too much about them, but I've decided to try to give them names and design in a direction that sort of makes sense and along the same sort of theme of ongoing effects that are more influential over the long term. When it comes to ghost types, I tend to think, of course, the sort of fear involved with ghost types. They have a lot of sort of spooky effects like Curse, where they will try to force a switch by doing a very intimidating damage over time effect. And they also have sort of a floatiness and bypassing barriers sort of effect, especially noticeable when they can ignore sort of arena locking effects like Shadow Tag. So to play along with that idea, I've decided to call the ghost type Z move Ethereal Panic. I set the base power at 60, so again that would be a decent hit to begin with. Ethereal Panic's long-term effect would give non-ghost Pokemon a 25% chance of being forced to switch at the end of each turn. The stab effect would increase that to a 50% chance. So this provides a whole bunch of sort of craziness by potentially shutting down stall, and kind of works with the scary feel, because you're never going to be sure if your Pokemon's even going to stay on the field, so you're going to be afraid to switch in case it forces you to switch again and allow your opponent to set up further. It also provides ghosts again with that sort of floatiness and bypassing feel by allowing them to bypass this forced switch effect. I felt like that would be a good thematic approach for ghosts. It focuses on the themes of fear. What's more scary than not knowing whether or not your Pokemon is going to be there next turn? I don't know. Rock types, to me, have always symbolized stability, defense, just being defensive in general. I mean, their stats have always sort of played this out, where they tend to be pretty bulky. They have a, moderately reliable defense pool, aside from all of the ways that they're bad. I mean, it seems like they were supposed to be designed defensively, but it sort of falls apart when you have such common typings that very easily take them out. But I mean, it seemed to be represented through their stats, through the sturdy ability. They just seem like they're designed to be bulky and defensive, nice and stable. For the Rock type Z move, I've called it Rock Guard. That's kind of a basic name. No damage, but a long-term effect. All rock Pokemon enter play with a substitute. The stab effect would actually give it a damaging component of 60 base power. So you would basically get free subs on all switch-ins of rock Pokemon, which would hopefully allow them to stay in battle a little bit longer, get some more setup, and deal with their generally abysmal speed stat. And also, if you chose to play it on a rock-type Pokemon, you would get a little bit of damage as a nice bonus, and be able to possibly take out something like a Charizard, or a Moltres, or, I don't know, something quad weak to rock, which there tends to be a good number of. I felt giving rock types a free substitute on switch-in would allow them to sort of play up their defensive capabilities without being one-shot by a Surf, or a Scald, or a Razor Leaf, or any of the other things that traditionally just one-shot a rock type and therefore make them pretty much undervalued. This would really buff things like Gigalith, Golem, just a lot of the slow rock types that are supposed to be defensive, but don't really bear that out as far as their typing is concerned. It would allow them a chance to do a little bit of setup and be a little bit more influential throughout the course of a game. When I think ground types, I think slow and steady. I mean, not all of them are slow, but in general, it seems like they kind of just plod along, they're nice and stable, they've got a job to do, and they're gonna just sort of plod along until it gets done. I'm talking like the Hippowdons, the Quagsires. That said, the ground Z move, I would call Tectonic Shift, and give 140 base power. This is so that it's just a nice, heavily damaging move, a little bit stronger than Earthquake, a good all-around, heavy-hitting attack that fits right in with the ground theme. And for the stab, this one's a little bit unique. Instead of providing an ongoing effect, this one's stab would be, if it knocks out an opponent, you get to choose what the next switch-in will be. To me, this would be a really unique effect and sort of game-changing. It could really give a ground type a huge swing in tempo and provide just a really more interesting approach to battling in general. Now, you can either choose something that will force an opponent to switch in. I mean, generally it would probably be used to switch in an opponent Pokemon that would be very suboptimal. Just make it a lot more difficult for them, give you a full turn to set up, and just do some interesting stuff. To me, it would tend to fit in with the getting your own way feel of the ground types, where the user would get to decide by allowing you to set the tone of the match by selecting which opponent you would like to face, and also, of course, canceling out other Z moves while you're at it. Dragon types are generally presented to have their own sort of mystical force about them, their own sort of mystical power. They're a little bit different from other Pokemon in that way. They're sort of presented as a step above the other types, I suppose, in a certain way. The Dragon Z move I would like to see would be called Dragon Force, kind of a play on the band name. I would give it 60 base power so it can do a solid hit. I mean, Dragon types are already known for having huge damaging attacks like Dragon Rush, Outrage, Dragon Claw. This one would have a long-term effect of healing 1/8 of all Dragon-type Pokemon's health at the end of each turn, and the stab effect would increase that to 1/4 of their health. Now that's a huge health bonus. Dragons tend to be pretty bulky, but they can be taken out fairly easily with Ice-type attacks as well. So I feel like this would be an interesting approach to give them a bit more bulk and provide to that mysterious air where they gain sort of regenerative abilities as they go, like the Dragon Blood and Dragon Scales, and just give them a little bit more of a defensive theming to go along with their general mystic feel. Poison types have always seemed all about the poison. I mean, obviously, the Poison type Z move would simply poison all opposing Pokemon. All opposing Pokemon would be hit with the poison status effect. The stab effect would simply increase this to badly poisoned, as in toxic. Poison types have always seemed to want to do some stall mechanics. I'm thinking Muck, Garbodor, Weezing, Skuntank. They tend to be pretty bulky, pretty defensively built, and centered around the idea of sort of stalling and hindering your opponent. I feel that popping a poison on all things, and with sort of the corrosion effect, so even opposing steel and poison types, would be a really interesting approach to doing this. Of course, that would be very easily countered by things like aromatherapy, but I don't see too much of aromatherapy nowadays, and maybe that would just make it more necessary to have. Possibly adding a little bit of damage to this move would provide a good push as well. Maybe something along the lines of 80 base power, but it's kind of hard to say what would be good to balance such a sweeping effect. Possibly even irremovable poison. Fairy types seem to be more defensive and support oriented. I mean, not necessarily strictly defensive, but more along the lines of helping out your team and supporting them through difficult issues, acting like a healer. A lot of the typical support Pokemon were given a fairy typing. A lot of the new fairy type fill a pretty consistent support role. We're talking like Florges, Klefki, Wigglytuff, just a lot of things that sort of either get a wish effect or aromatherapy, heal bell. A lot of things along those lines tend to be fairy types. Fairy typing seems to have a theme of regeneration, healing, and support. The fairy type Z move would be Galactic Glow. It would have 80 base power and provide an aromatherapy effect. The stab bonus would also heal all of your allies by 1/4 of their missing health. I felt like this would emphasize fairy types being healers and support units, being able to pop a quick heal and also get a little bit of damage off in the meantime. The heal isn't particularly substantial with 1/4 of the health, but it could provide that little bit of push that's needed and act sort of as like an all-around weaker wish, something that I think the fairy types find a lot of use from, especially if they're using things like Regenerator and other things along those lines. The normal type has always been sort of a weird one. It tends to represent just basic animals, but more interestingly, I find that it has sort of a prismatic vibe to it in all types or omni-types, like a rainbow effect. I mean, really subtly, you can see this in a lot of the normal type Pokemon cards, where they'll have sort of rainbow coloring to their border. And of course, Arceus and Regigigas, which represent a unity of typings, are of the normal type. The same thing is true with moves like Tri-Attack, which is meant to represent sort of a rainbow type effect that can inflict all sorts of different statuses, and Hyper Beam, sort of represents the white light prism sort of concept. The normal type Z move would be called Prism Burst. It would deal 120 base damage and ignore typing and also stat boosts. This way, it would be a solid hit against any opponent, regardless of how buffed they may be. For the stab bonus, it would also ignore typing, so it would be able to hit ghosts and hit for neutral on any Pokemon. So it would be a very powerful hit, sort of going with the prismatic feel of bypassing all of the types, because in a way, it is all of the types. This would make normal types a bit more influential to run, because they could always hit something for a whole lot of damage and cancel out any other of the long-term Z-move effects while they're doing it. So those were a few ideas for Z-moves and how I'm hoping they could be implemented for Sun and Moon. I'm hoping that they'll be more influential than simply a huge damage boost, and maybe they'll provide something interesting to think about for the meta. I'd like to see your ideas. Do you think just a straight high damage attack would be worth an item slot, or are you hoping for a more nuanced approach? Are these too overpowered? Not powerful enough? What would you like to see in the Z moves, and how do you hope they're handled? Both for the one-player game and, of course, for the competitive meta. Thank you for watching.